Well, there's news tonight about a couple of longtime city employees who announced their retirements this week. Assistant City Manager Keith Selman was promoted to the Assistant CM position back in 2017, overseeing 6 departments, including Parks and Recreation and Solid Waste Services. At one point last year, he actually served as interim city manager and was even considered a candidate for the permanent job. Of course, the city ultimately chose Peter Zanoni to fill that seat. And Zanoni tells us the city now has 2 assistant city manager vacancies, and they have turned to a national recruiting firm to help find the right people for those spots. In fact, Zanoni says there are 6 candidates already, and they hope to have both positions filled by the end of January. And the second person who is set to retire is longtime director at the Corpus Christi International Airport, Fred Segundo. He had 13 years of service with the city, and our best wishes to both of those gentlemen for whatever they decide to do next.